The viewport showed nothing but black. I'd been piloting deep-sea submersibles for 14 years, and the darkness never got easier. The Triton's reach descended through the water column at a steady rate of 30 meters per minute, exactly according to protocol. I kept my eyes on the depth gauge as the numbers climbed. 8,000 meters, 8,200, 8,500. We were heading into the Challenger Deep, the deepest point in any ocean on Earth, and every meter we dropped added another atmosphere of pressure against the hull. The cabin temperature had climbed to 28 degrees Celsius, despite the environmental controls running at maximum capacity. Sweat soaked through my shirt and collected at the small of my back. I reached up and adjusted the ventilation duct for the third time in 20 minutes, but it didn't help. The heat came from the friction of our descent and the compression of the water around us, not from any failure of the cooling system. Nothing to do but endure it. I checked the primary pressure gauge, then cross-referenced it with the backup system. Both read the same, 8,700 meters. The hull groaned softly as the ocean pressed against it from all sides. That sound was normal. I'd heard it on every deep dive I'd ever made. The Triton's reach was rated for 11,000 meters, and the engineers had built in a safety margin beyond that. But the groaning still made my jaw clench every single time. Behind me, the two corporate fixers sat in the observer seats without making a sound. Benjamin Weaver occupied the portside station. Grayson Barnes sat starboard. They'd been assigned to this expedition by the parent company 3 days before we shipped out, and I still didn't understand why they were here. The official documentation listed them as Project Oversight Specialists, which told me absolutely nothing. Neither of them had any background in marine biology, geology, or deep-sea operations. Their personnel files were so generic, they might as well have been blank. I'd tried asking them direct questions during the surface prep. Benjamin had given me polite non-answers. Grayson had just stared at me until I stopped talking. The depth gauge hit 9,000 meters. I wiped sweat from my forehead and glanced at the environmental readout. Cabin humidity was at 72%. The recyclers were struggling to keep up with the moisture from our breathing and perspiration. I made a mental note to check the filters when we surfaced, assuming the descent didn't find some new way to kill us all first. My shirt clung to my shoulders and chest. I pulled at the fabric, trying to get some airflow against my skin, but it didn't help. The heat wrapped around me like a wet blanket. I looked back at Benjamin and Grayson to see how they were handling it. Both of them sat perfectly still in their seats, hands resting on their knees, posture straight. Their shirts showed no sweat stains. Their faces were completely dry. I stared at Benjamin for a long moment, watching for any sign of discomfort. Nothing. His expression remained neutral and calm, like he was sitting in an air-conditioned office instead of a pressure cooker descending into the deepest trench on the planet. Grayson looked exactly the same, composed, unbothered, and completely dry. That wasn't right. I turned back to the controls and tried to focus on the instruments. Maybe they were just better at handling the heat. Some people didn't sweat as much as others. That was a thing. I'd worked with a Norwegian engineer once who barely perspired even in tropical conditions. Genetics, he'd told me. His family came from cold climates, but two people on the same expedition, both of them completely unaffected by heat that had me soaked through. That seemed like more than genetics. I checked the pressure readings again. 9,300 meters. The hull groaned louder, a long metallic complaint that resonated through the frame of the submersible. I felt the vibration in my boots and in the armrests of my seat. The pressure equalization system kicked in with a sharp hiss. My ears popped so hard it felt like someone had driven ice picks through my eardrums. I grimaced and worked my jaw, trying to equalize the pressure manually. The pain spread from my ears down into my sinuses and across my temples. I swallowed hard, felt the cartilage in my throat click, and the pressure eased slightly. Another swallow, another click, and the pain faded to a dull ache. I turned around to check on Benjamin and Grayson. Both of them sat in exactly the same positions as before. Their expressions hadn't changed. Neither of them was working their jaw or swallowing or showing any sign that the pressure change had affected them at all. I watched Benjamin for 10 seconds. He didn't move, didn't swallow, didn't even blink. Then I timed it. 30 seconds passed. Benjamin's eyes stayed open, fixed on the back of my seat. No blinking, no eye movement, just a steady, unbroken focus that didn't waver. I shifted my attention to Grayson. Same thing. His eyes were locked on the starboard viewport, and in the 45 seconds I watched him, his eyelids never moved. Humans blinked every 3 to 4 seconds on average. I'd learned that in a survival training course years ago. The instructor had used it as an example of autonomic functions we took for granted. You could hold your breath consciously, but you couldn't stop yourself from blinking. Not for long. The reflex was too strong. But Benjamin and Grayson weren't blinking. I faced forward and gripped the control stick harder than necessary. My palms were slick with sweat. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe they were both just zoned out, staring at nothing while their minds wandered. Maybe the pressure was affecting them differently than it affected me. Maybe I was imagining things because the heat and the depth and the isolation were getting to me. The sonar pinged. I looked at the display screen and saw a return signal coming from directly ahead. Distance, 200 meters. Size, massive. I cut the descent speed in half and activated the external floodlights. The beams sliced through the darkness and revealed the ocean floor 60 meters below us. Silt and sediment covered the bottom in a thick layer of gray-brown muck. Small rocks jutted up here and there, worn smooth by the current. Nothing unusual, nothing that would generate a sonar return that large. I adjusted the angle of the lights and swept them across the area ahead. The beams caught something vertical. I stopped the descent completely and held the Triton's reach in position with the maneuvering thrusters. The sonar pinged again. 150 meters. Whatever was out there, we were getting closer. I increased the intensity of the floodlights and pushed the submersible forward at half speed. The structure came into view slowly, emerging from the darkness like a nightmare taking shape. It was a spire. The thing rose from the ocean floor in a twisting column of black obsidian and iridescent metal that spiraled upward until it disappeared beyond the range of the lights. The surface was smooth, not naturally smooth, but machined smooth. Geometric patterns covered the entire visible section, precise angles and curves that interlocked in ways that hurt to look at. The metal sections gleamed with colors that shifted as the light moved across them. Green to purple to blue to something that didn't have a name. I brought the Triton's reach to a full stop, 20 meters from the base of the spire. The structure was at least 40 meters in diameter at the bottom, and it tapered as it rose. I couldn't see the top. The sonar was having trouble getting a clear reading on the upper sections. The signal kept scattering and breaking apart like the spire was interfering with it somehow. I stared at the thing and felt my training collide with what my eyes were telling me. Obsidian didn't form in spiral patterns. Metal didn't grow naturally at the bottom of the ocean. Geometric precision didn't happen by accident in geological processes. This thing was constructed, designed, built by something with tools and knowledge and purpose. And it was sitting at the bottom of the Challenger Deep, where nothing should exist except mud and microorganisms. I checked the instruments. The depth gauge read 9,843 meters. Water temperature, 1.5 degrees Celsius. Salinity, Normal. Current. Negligible. Then I looked at the energy signature display. The spire was emitting radiation across multiple spectrums. Low-level electromagnetic pulses cycled in regular intervals, one pulse every 3.2 seconds. The pattern was too consistent to be natural, too deliberate. I activated the recording systems and began the standard survey protocol. External cameras. Engaged. Sonar mapping. Active. Sample collection arms. Ready. I logged the timestamp and coordinates, then started a slow clockwise orbit around the base of the structure. Benjamin's voice came from directly behind me. Dock the submersible with the structure. I didn't turn around. I kept my hands on the controls and my eyes on the spire. We need to complete the survey first, I said. Standard protocol requires full external documentation before any physical contact. Dock the submersible, Benjamin repeated. His voice was flat and cold, like he was reading from a script. Use frequency code 7739 alpha. I turned around and looked at him. He was standing now, one hand resting on the back of my seat. His eyes were fixed on me with that same unblinking focus I'd noticed earlier. No expression, no emotion, just cold certainty. There's no docking port on this vessel, I said. The Triton's reach isn't designed for structural interface. Use frequency code 7739 alpha, Benjamin said again. Transmit it through the primary communications array. I looked at Grayson. He was standing too, positioned at the starboard side of the cabin. Both of them were blocking the path to the emergency ascent lever. How do you know that code? I asked. Benjamin didn't answer. He just kept staring at me with those eyes that never blinked. I opened my mouth to refuse again, to tell Benjamin exactly where he could shove his docking sequence, but I never got the chance. Something grabbed my shoulder from behind. The pressure was immediate and wrong. Grayson's fingers dug into the muscle above my collarbone with a force that made my vision blur at the edges. It didn't feel like a human hand at all. The grip was too hard, too cold, like someone had wrapped leather over stone and taught it to squeeze. I tried to twist away, but I might as well have been trying to move a boulder. What the hell? Grayson yanked me backward. My hips slammed into the edge of the console, knocking the wind out of me. I stumbled, arms flailing for balance, and crashed into the bulkhead behind the pilot seat. My skull bounced off the metal with enough force that bright spots danced across my vision. By the time I blinked them away and pushed myself upright, Grayson had already taken my place at the controls. His fingers moved across the touchscreen interface with unsettling speed and precision. He didn't hesitate, didn't fumble with the unfamiliar layout. He knew exactly where to go, exactly what to press. I watched him navigate through 3 nested security menus in the span of maybe 5 seconds, menus that should have required passwords I'd never shared with anyone. Stop, I said. My voice came out rough, half-choked. You can't just... Grayson ignored me completely. He pulled up the communications array and entered the frequency code Benjamin had mentioned, 7739 alpha, into the transmission field. His movements were mechanical, deliberate, like he'd done this 1,000 times before. I pushed off the bulkhead and lunged toward him, reaching for the emergency override panel mounted on the starboard wall. If I could hit the manual disconnect, I could sever the magnetic coupling system before it engaged. My fingers were maybe 6 inches from the panel when the entire submersible lurched sideways. The sound hit me first, a deep metallic clang that reverberated through the hull like a bell being struck. Then came the vibration, a bone-deep thrumming that rattled my teeth and made the deck plates shiver beneath my boots. I grabbed the nearest handhold to keep from falling as the Triton's reach tilted forward at a 15-degree angle. The magnetic clamps had engaged. I stared at the external camera feed on the main display. The view showed the spire's surface in stark detail under the floodlights. Those spiraling bands of black obsidian and iridescent metal now pressed directly against the submersible's ventral hull. 4 magnetic coupling arms had extended from the underside of the Triton's reach without my authorization, locking onto recessed anchor points in the spire's surface that I hadn't even noticed before. The connection looked deliberate, engineered, like the spire had been designed for this exact purpose. My stomach dropped. We were locked in now. Severing the magnetic clamps at this depth would require a full system reboot that would take at least 3 minutes. 3 minutes we'd spend drifting without maneuvering control in the pitch-black abyss of the Challenger Deep. And that was assuming the clamps would even release. If they didn't, we'd be stuck here until the oxygen ran out in about 72 hours. I turned toward Benjamin, ready to demand an explanation, ready to threaten him with every legal consequence I could think of. But the words died in my throat before I could speak them. Benjamin was making sounds I'd never heard a human make. They came from deep in his chest, sharp clicks like someone snapping wooden dowels in half, followed by long, sibilant hisses that seemed to bypass his vocal cords entirely. The rhythm was deliberate, structured, almost like speech, but completely alien. Each click had a distinct pitch, and the hisses varied in length and intensity. It sounded ancient, predatory, like something that belonged in a cave system millions of years removed from human civilization. Grayson responded in the same language. His version had a higher pitch, faster cadence, but the same unsettling quality. Clicks and hisses arranged in patterns that my brain kept trying to interpret as words but couldn't quite grasp. They were having a conversation, in a language that shouldn't exist. I backed up until my spine hit the bulkhead again. My hands found the cold metal surface behind me and pressed flat against it, anchoring me to something solid and real. I couldn't look away from them, couldn't process what I was hearing. Then Benjamin's hand moved to his neck. He hooked his fingers under the skin just below his jawline, right where the carotid artery should have been. I expected blood, expected him to cry out in pain. Instead, he pulled. The skin tore, but there was no blood, no muscle tissue, no subcutaneous fat, just a clean separation, like he was peeling off a latex mask. Underneath, where human flesh should have been, I saw scales. Emerald green scales that caught the cabin light and threw it back in iridescent patterns, greens and golds and deep blues that shifted as he moved. My brain refused to accept what I was seeing. It kept insisting this was a trick, a hallucination brought on by pressure sickness or oxygen deprivation. But the details were too sharp, too specific. I could see individual scales, each one diamond-shaped and overlapping like roof tiles. I could see the way they flexed as Benjamin continued pulling the synthetic skin away from his face. He worked methodically, unbothered by my presence. He peeled the false flesh down from his forehead, revealing a flat reptilian skull with pronounced brow ridges. The human eyes I'd been looking at for the past 3 hours came away with the mask, sophisticated prosthetics that had hidden what lay beneath. His real eyes were larger, set wider apart, with vertical pupils that contracted to thin black slits in the cabin light. They were the color of old amber, flecked with gold, and they held an intelligence that was vast and utterly inhuman. The human nose was fake too. Underneath was a flat snout with 2 horizontal slits that flared and contracted with each breath, nostrils designed for an atmosphere I couldn't begin to guess at. His mouth was wider than a human's, lipless, filled with rows of small, sharp teeth that looked like they belonged on something aquatic. Benjamin dropped the synthetic skin onto the deck. It landed in a crumpled heap that still vaguely resembled a human face, empty eyes staring at nothing. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My entire understanding of reality had just been ripped away and replaced with something impossible. Then I made the mistake of looking at Grayson. He was doing the same thing. His fingers worked under the skin at his temples, pulling the false flesh away in long strips that tore with soft ripping sounds. The scales underneath were darker than Benjamin's, deep forest green with black striations that formed patterns across his skull. His eyes, when they were finally revealed, were cold silver with the same vertical pupils. The human disguises had been perfect, flawless. I'd spent hours in an enclosed space with these things and never suspected, never noticed. They'd mimicked breathing patterns, facial expressions, body language, everything. And all of it had been a lie. Grayson let his discarded skin fall next to Benjamin's. The two masks lay there like shed cocoons, empty and deflated. Benjamin turned to face me fully. When he spoke, his voice was the same as before, that precise corporate tone. But now I could see the way his alien mouth struggled to form human phonemes. His lipless jaw moved in ways that looked painful, unnatural, forcing sounds his anatomy wasn't designed to produce. "The spire is a relic," he said. Each word was crisp, deliberate. "It was built by our ancestors 300 million years ago, long before your species crawled out of the oceans, long before mammals even existed." I tried to respond, but nothing came out. My throat had locked up completely. Benjamin continued, unbothered by my silence. "We have come to retrieve a power core from within. The energy signature you detected is a beacon, designed to guide our kind back to this location across geological timescales. It has been waiting here, dormant, since the Permian period. 300 million years. The number was too vast to comprehend. Humans had only existed for maybe 300,000 years. Civilization for 10,000. These things, whatever they were, had been building structures when Earth's continents were still fused into Pangaea. Grayson moved away from the controls and positioned himself between me and the emergency ascent lever. His silver eyes tracked my movements with predatory focus. He didn't blink. Didn't need to. Benjamin took a step closer. The deck plates groaned under his weight, not because he was heavy, but because his movements had changed. Without the human disguise, he no longer bothered to mimic human biomechanics. Each step was too precise, too balanced, like something designed for a different gravity. He stopped about 3 feet away from me, close enough that I could see the texture of his scales, the way they overlapped in geometric patterns that looked almost artificial. Close enough that I could smell him, a sharp mineral scent like wet stone and ozone. "You are a loose end, Nashbird," he said. My name sounded wrong in his mouth, the syllables too sharp. "You have seen what no human was meant to see. You possess knowledge that would destabilize your species' entire understanding of its place in this planet's history." I found my voice finally, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "What are you?" Benjamin's head tilted at an angle no human neck could achieve. 45 degrees, perfectly level, held there without the slightest tremor. "Your paleontologists have found fragments of us in the fossil record. They call us reptilia. They theorize about our extinction, never suspecting that we simply went elsewhere when the planet's climate shifted. We have been watching your species for millennia, waiting to see if you would develop sufficiently to be worth contacting or eliminating." The cabin felt smaller suddenly. The walls seemed to press in from all sides. I was trapped in a pressurized tube nearly 7 miles underwater with 2 alien predators who had just admitted they'd been deciding whether humanity deserved to exist. "The power core," I managed. "What does it do?" "That is not your concern." Benjamin's amber eyes fixed on me with absolute focus. What concerns you is this: you can never be allowed to surface. You can never report what you have witnessed here. The truth of our presence must remain hidden until we decide the time is appropriate for revelation. My legs felt weak. I locked my knees to keep from sliding down the bulkhead. "You're going to kill me." An inelegant term, but accurate. Benjamin showed no emotion, no hesitation. He stated it like he was confirming a depth reading or a pressure gauge measurement. "Your death will be recorded as equipment failure at extreme depth. The submersible will be recovered with significant hull damage. Your body will show signs of rapid decompression. It will be unfortunate, but not suspicious. These incidents occur with regularity in deep-sea exploration." Grayson moved closer to the emergency systems panel, blocking it completely now. His silver eyes never left me. He wasn't blinking either. Neither of them had blinked since removing their disguises. I looked at the controls, at the camera feed showing the spire's surface pressed against our hull, at the depth gauge reading 9,843 meters. We were at the bottom of the deepest trench on Earth, locked to an alien structure that had been waiting here since before dinosaurs existed, and the only two other souls aboard wanted me dead. My hands were shaking. I pressed them harder against the bulkhead to hide it, but I knew they could see. Knew they could probably smell the fear coming off me in waves. Benjamin took another step forward. "We will make it quick," he said. "That is the only mercy we can offer." I sat frozen in the pilot seat, every muscle locked tight. Benjamin stood 3 feet away, and though he no longer held a physical weapon, the threat in his vertical pupil eyes was enough to keep me pinned. Grayson moved past us toward the equipment bay at the stern of the sub, his clawed feet scraping against the deck plating with each deliberate step. The sound made my skin crawl. Benjamin didn't speak. He just watched me with that reptilian stillness, his scaled chest barely rising with breath. I wondered if he even needed to breathe the same way humans did, or if that had been part of the disguise too. The measured inhales and exhales I'd registered unconsciously during the descent, my brain cataloging them as normal human behavior without ever questioning it. From the equipment bay came the screech of metal on metal. I jerked my head toward the sound, but Benjamin shifted his weight and I froze again. The grinding noise intensified, followed by a sharp hydraulic hiss that made my stomach drop. I knew that sound. I'd heard it during maintenance cycles on the surface, when the engineers tested the ballast systems and purged the tanks. But we weren't on the surface. We were at the bottom of the ocean, and Grayson was back there doing something to the controls that kept us stable. Another hiss, then a clang that reverberated through the hull. I gripped the armrests of the pilot seat, my palms slick with sweat. The temperature in the cabin hadn't dropped. If anything, it felt hotter now, the humidity thick enough to make each breath feel labored. My shirt clung to my back. Benjamin's scales, by contrast, looked dry and pristine, catching the dim overhead lighting in shifting patterns of emerald and gold. "What is he doing?" I managed to say. My voice came out hoarse. Benjamin tilted his head, the motion too fluid, too precise. "Ensuring your containment." The grinding noise stopped. Footsteps approached from the stern, and Grayson emerged from the equipment bay, his clawed hands streaked with dark hydraulic fluid. He moved to Benjamin's side and spoke in that clicking, hissing language I couldn't parse. The sounds were sharp and rapid, punctuated by guttural stops that seemed to come from deep in his throat. Benjamin responded in kind, his voice lower, but equally alien. Grayson turned his silver eyes on me for a moment, then looked back at Benjamin and made a series of short clicks. Benjamin's mouth opened slightly, revealing rows of those needle-sharp teeth, and I realized he was expressing satisfaction. The ballast controls are locked open, Benjamin said, switching back to English. His accent had changed. It was still intelligible, but the cadence was off now, the vowels flatter and the consonants harder. He wasn't bothering to mimic human speech patterns anymore. Once we depart in the escape pod, the Triton will flood its tanks and sink past crush depth. You will die slowly, watching the pressure gauges climb. I stared at him. My brain tried to process the words, to fit them into some framework that made sense, but all I could focus on was the casual certainty in his tone. He wasn't threatening me. He was explaining a fact, the same way I might explain how a hydraulic coupling worked or why a sonar array needed calibration. You sabotaged the ballast? I said. Grayson disabled the manual overrides and locked the intake valves in the open position, Benjamin said. The automated systems will detect the imbalance and attempt to correct, but the fail-safes have been bypassed. The sub will continue taking on water until the pressure exceeds structural tolerance. My hands tightened on the armrests. I looked past Benjamin toward the equipment bay, then at the control console in front of me. The ballast readouts were part of the secondary systems panel, tucked into a sub-menu I hadn't checked since we started the descent. I thought about pulling it up now, confirming what he just said, but I knew it wouldn't matter. Even if I could see the damage on the readouts, I couldn't fix it from here. The manual overrides were physical mechanisms in the equipment bay, and Grayson had just spent the last few minutes making sure I couldn't access them. The crush depth, I started. 7,200 meters, Benjamin interrupted. We are currently at 6,712 meters. You have approximately 18 minutes before hull failure, assuming the intake rate remains constant. It may be less if the fractures in the outer plating expand under stress. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Not panic, not yet. Just a creeping awareness that this was real, that I was actually going to die down here unless I found a way out in the next 18 minutes. 17 now. Maybe 16. Benjamin and Grayson moved toward the airlock at the forward section of the cabin, near the viewport. The escape pod was accessible through a sealed hatch built into the hull, designed for emergencies when the main sub was compromised. I'd never used it. I'd never even run a drill. The pod was a last resort, a cramped sphere barely large enough for 2 people, with limited oxygen and no propulsion beyond an emergency ballast drop that would send it rocketing toward the surface. Grayson reached the hatch first and began working the manual release. The wheel spun under his clawed hands, each rotation smooth and practiced. He knew the system. They both did. I wondered how long they'd been planning this, how many details they'd memorized during the descent while I'd focused on keeping us alive. Benjamin stayed between me and the hatch, his body angled so he could watch both me and Grayson. I thought about rushing him, trying to shove past and get to the escape pod before they sealed it, but the idea died as soon as it formed. He was 7 feet tall, his legs corded with muscle, his clawed hands capable of crushing bone. I'd seen how fast Grayson moved when he'd grabbed me earlier. I wouldn't make it 2 steps. Grayson pulled the hatch open. Beyond it, I could see the cramped interior of the escape pod, its walls lined with oxygen canisters and emergency supplies. The pod's own viewport was dark, reflecting the dim cabin lights back at us. Grayson stepped through the hatch, his body folding to fit the smaller space, and turned to wait for Benjamin. Benjamin looked back at me one final time. He didn't speak at first, just studied me with those unblinking amber eyes. Then he said, "Your species is fragile. You build machines to carry you into places your bodies cannot survive, and you call it progress. But you are still bound by your limitations. We are not." There was something in his tone that wasn't quite contempt. It was closer to pity, the kind of detached sympathy you might feel for an insect trapped under glass. "You didn't have to do this," I said. My voice sounded weak, even to me. "We did," Benjamin said. "You witnessed what cannot be known. That makes you a liability." He turned and stepped through the hatch, his scaled body moving with that same unnatural fluidity. Grayson reached for the interior wheel, and I saw the hatch begin to swing closed. The last thing I saw was Benjamin's face, framed in the shrinking gap, his expression empty of anything I could recognize as emotion. The hatch sealed with a heavy clang that echoed through the cabin. I heard the locking mechanism engage, a series of metallic clicks that sounded final. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the sealed hatch. Then the Triton lurched downward, a sudden violent drop that threw me against the restraints. I grabbed the console to steady myself, my heart slamming against my ribs. The sub tilted forward, the nose dipping at an angle that sent loose equipment sliding across the deck. I heard the escape pod detach. It was a metallic clang followed by a deep groaning sound from the hull, and then the Triton shuddered and dropped again. The descent wasn't smooth. It was a jerking, uneven fall, the kind of motion that told me the ballast tanks were flooding fast, and the weight distribution was already compromised. Water sprayed from somewhere near the port side. I twisted in the seat and saw a thin jet of seawater shooting from a hairline fracture in the hull plating, just above the equipment bay entrance. The stream was narrow but pressurized, hitting the opposite wall with enough force to leave a wet streak on the metal. I looked at the depth gauge. 6,800 meters. The numbers climbed as I watched. 6,850, 6,900. The sub's crush depth was 7,200 meters. I had minutes at most. I pressed my forehead against the cold viewport glass, trying to steady my breathing and get a better angle on the escape pod's trajectory. The external floodlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the spire behind us and the seafloor below. Except the seafloor wasn't behaving like it should. The sediment moved, not drifted, not settled, moved with purpose. I blinked hard, convinced the pressure or oxygen deprivation was messing with my head, but when I looked again, the movement had intensified. What I'd assumed was a blanket of pale silt covering the ocean floor began to shift in rolling waves, like something breathing beneath a sheet. The patterns were too deliberate, too organic. Ridges formed and collapsed. Valleys opened and closed. Then the eye opened. I stopped breathing. It wasn't small. It wasn't anything close to small. The eye measured at least 30 meters across, maybe more, glowing with bioluminescent blue light that pulsed in slow, rhythmic intervals. The pupil was vertical, elongated, and darker than the surrounding water. It didn't blink. It didn't move. It just existed, radiating light that spread across the trench floor like spilled paint. My brain struggled to process the scale. If that was an eye, then the sediment I'd been looking at wasn't sediment at all. The entire sea floor was something alive. I gripped the edge of the console, my fingers digging into the metal hard enough to hurt. The Triton continued its jerking descent, groaning and shuddering as ballast tanks flooded, but I couldn't look away from the viewport. The creature beneath us began to rise. Segments emerged from the mud, massive interlocking plates of what looked like bone or chitin, each one larger than a city bus, covered in barnacles and coral growth that must have accumulated over centuries, maybe millennia. The segments moved independently but in coordination, flexing and rotating as the creature pulled itself free from the trench floor. Clouds of disturbed sediment billowed upward, obscuring parts of the body, but I could make out enough to understand I was looking at something that predated human existence by an incomprehensible margin. The bioluminescent patterns weren't limited to the eye. Lines of blue light traced along the edges of each segment, pulsing in sequence from the creature's head toward what I assumed was its tail. somewhere beyond the range of the floodlights. The light intensified as the creature rose, casting everything in an eerie underwater glow. I forced myself to look toward the escape pod. It was ascending rapidly, already 50 meters above us and climbing. The pod's emergency beacon flashed red against the blue glow, a tiny speck of human technology fleeing toward the surface. Benjamin and Grayson were inside that pod. They'd sabotaged my sub, left me to die, and now they were escaping with whatever knowledge they'd come here to retrieve. The creature turned its attention upward. The eye tracked the pod's movement with perfect precision. Then the body followed, segments undulating in a wave that propelled the massive form through the water with shocking speed. I watched appendages unfold from the creature's sides, long and segmented like a centipede's legs, but ending in clusters of hooked claws. Each appendage was easily 20 meters long. There were dozens of them. The Triton lurched again, dropping another 10 meters. The depth gauge read 6,973 meters. I had maybe 12 minutes before we hit crush depth. The fracture above the equipment bay had widened, spraying pressurized seawater in a steady stream that pooled on the deck and sloshed toward the stern with each tilt of the sub. I couldn't stop the flooding. Grayson had made sure of that when he sabotaged the ballast controls. The manual overrides were locked open, the automated systems bypassed, the fail-safes disabled. Water was pouring into the tanks faster than any pump could clear it, even if I could access the pumps, which I couldn't. But I could stop the sinking. The thought cut through the terror like a blade. I tore my attention away from the viewport and scanned the cabin, looking for anything that could reduce our weight. The Triton was loaded with external equipment, robotic sampling arms, battery banks, sensor arrays, tool storage. All of it added mass, and all of it was expendable. I crawled across the tilting deck toward the starboard wall where the manual override panel for external equipment was mounted. My hands shook so badly I had to grip the deck plating to pull myself forward. The sub groaned around me, metal protesting against the increasing pressure. The spray from the fracture hit my back, soaking through my shirt and chilling me to the bone. The panel was recessed into the wall, protected by a hinged cover with a red and yellow hazard stripe. I flipped it open and stared at the rows of switches and buttons, each one labeled in white stenciled letters. Emergency jettison sequence. I'd never used it before. It was designed for catastrophic situations where the sub needed to shed weight immediately, usually in response to flooding or power failure. This qualified. I found the master switch and hesitated. Once I activated the sequence, there was no taking it back. Thousands of pounds of equipment would explode away from the hull, tumbling into the abyss. The company would bill me for every lost component. If I survived, I'd spend the rest of my career paying off the debt. If I survived. I flipped the switch. The Triton shuddered violently as explosive bolts detonated in sequence along the hull. I heard the robotic arm array detach first, a series of metallic clangs followed by the groan of stressed metal. Then the external battery banks blew free, their mounting brackets shattering under the force of the charges. Sensor arrays followed. Tool storage. Emergency flotation bags we'd never deployed. Everything not essential to the pressure hull itself separated and fell away. The sub jerked upward, or more accurately, stopped sinking as fast. I grabbed the nearest handhold and pulled myself toward the viewport, needing to see what was happening outside. The creature had reached the escape pod. I watched, frozen, as the Guardian wrapped itself around the pod like a constrictor around prey. The appendages I'd seen earlier now extended fully, their hooked claws piercing the pod's outer hull with surgical precision. The pod's emergency systems fired, thrusters burning in a desperate attempt to break free, but the creature didn't even seem to notice. It just tightened its grip. The massive jaws opened. I hadn't realized the creature had a mouth until that moment. What I'd thought was the front of its head split vertically, revealing rows of teeth that looked like shards of obsidian, each one longer than a person. The interior of the mouth glowed with the same bioluminescent blue as the eye, pulsing brighter as the jaws widened. The escape pod disappeared inside. The jaws closed like a vice, metal crumpling under pressure that made the Triton's hull stress look gentle. I heard nothing through the water, but I saw the pod's hull buckle and collapse, the red emergency beacon flickering once before going dark. Then the pod imploded. The flash of blue energy was so bright I had to shield my eyes. It lit up the entire trench, turning the darkness into blazing daylight for a fraction of a second. I saw the creature in full detail, every segment, every appendage, every barnacle-covered plate. I saw the spire behind it, the obsidian and iridescent metal reflecting the light. I saw debris from the jettisoned equipment tumbling through the water column. Then the shockwave hit. The Triton flipped sideways, throwing me across the cabin like a rag doll. I slammed into the bulkhead shoulder first, pain exploding through my collarbone and ribs. Equipment tore loose from its mountings and clattered across the deck. The viewport cracked, a single hairline fracture running from the top edge to the center. Alarms screamed, red lights flashing across every panel. I lay on the deck gasping, trying to inventory which parts of my body still worked. My shoulder throbbed. My ribs ached with every breath. But I could move. I could think. I rolled onto my side and looked at the depth gauge. 7,014 meters. It had stopped climbing. I needed to move. The thought cut through the ringing in my ears and the throbbing pain radiating from my shoulder. My hands found purchase on the deck plating, slick with condensation and hydraulic fluid, and I pulled myself forward. Every muscle protested. The collision with the bulkhead had left my right side screaming, ribs bruised at minimum, maybe cracked. I pushed past it. The emergency ascent controls were mounted on the forward panel, just below the main navigation console. I drilled the location into my memory during certification training, back when catastrophic scenarios were theoretical exercises on laminated cards. My fingers closed around the console edge and I hauled myself upright, legs shaking beneath me. The panel cover was bright yellow with black hazard stripes, impossible to miss even in the strobing red alarm lights that painted everything in sharp, stuttering shadows. I flipped the cover open. Beneath it sat 3 switches arranged vertically, each protected by a clear safety guard. The top switch was labeled Chemical Blow, Primary. The second read Chemical Blow, Secondary. The third, smaller and set apart, read Emergency Surface Beacon. My hand hovered over the primary switch. Once I activated this, there was no stopping the ascent. The chemical reaction would flood the ballast tanks with compressed gas. Forcing out the water Grayson had sabotaged the controls to let in. The Triton would shoot upward whether I wanted it to or not. At this depth, an uncontrolled ascent carried its own risks. Decompression sickness wasn't a factor in a sealed cabin, but structural stress was. The hull had already taken damage. The hairline crack in the viewport hadn't spread yet, but rapid pressure changes could turn it into a spiderweb of fractures. I looked at the depth gauge. 7,014 meters. The crush depth rating was 7,200. We weren't sinking anymore, but we weren't stable either. The ballast tanks were still compromised. Water was still coming in through the fracture above the equipment bay, spraying in a thin, pressurized jet that soaked the deck. Eventually, the weight would overcome the temporary equilibrium from jettisoning the external equipment. I flipped up the safety guard and threw the primary switch. The response was immediate. A deep, resonant thud reverberated through the hull as the chemical canisters ignited somewhere in the Triton's underbelly. I felt the vibration in my bones, in my teeth. Gas hissed through the ballast system with a sound like industrial steam vents opening all at once. The sub lurched beneath me, and I grabbed the console with both hands, bracing myself. Then we were moving. The Triton shot upward with force that pressed me down against the deck. My knees buckled and I went down hard, pain flaring in my shoulder again. I rolled onto my back and stared up at the overhead pipes and conduits racing past my vision as the sub climbed. The ascent felt violent, uncontrolled. Nothing like the slow, measured descent we'd maintained on the way down. I twisted my head toward the viewport. Outside, the external floodlights carved cones of illumination through the water, revealing debris tumbling past us in the opposite direction. Pieces of metal, twisted and torn. I recognized the curved plating of the escape pod's outer hull, bent at angles that spoke to catastrophic structural failure. A section of internal framework spun past, trailing severed cables, then something smaller, pale against the darkness. Synthetic skin. A sheet of it, ragged at the edges, drifted past the viewport like discarded paper. I watched it tumble away into the black. Then I saw the hand. It was clawed, scaled, fingers splayed wide in a frozen grasp. Forest green with black striations. Grayson's hand. The wrist ended in a jagged tear, bone and tissue exposed. It rotated slowly as it fell, caught in the turbulence of our ascent, and then the floodlights lost it. I closed my eyes. My breathing came in short, shallow gasps. The image was burned into my vision even in the darkness behind my eyelids. I forced myself to open them again, to focus on the viewport, on the debris field we were climbing through. More fragments passed. I couldn't identify most of them. Metal shards, plastic housings, unrecognizable components reduced to scrap. The escape pod had been utterly destroyed. Whatever that creature was, whatever ancient thing had been sleeping on the ocean floor masquerading as sediment, it had crushed Benjamin and Grayson like insects. The Triton shuddered around me, groaning under the stress of rapid ascent. I pushed myself up onto my hands and knees, then crawled toward the pilot seat. My shoulders screamed protest with every movement, but I ignored it. I needed to monitor the systems, needed to make sure this ascent didn't kill me after everything else had failed to. I pulled myself into the seat and scanned the control panels. Red lights dominated the displays. Hull integrity warnings flashed on 3 separate monitors. The fracture above the equipment bay had widened, the spray of seawater now a steady stream arcing across the cabin. Electrical systems showed failures in the portside sensor array, the robotic arm controllers, the external sample storage. All jettisoned equipment, their connections severed when the explosive bolts fired. But the ascent continued. The depth gauge numbers scrolled downward with steady progress. 6,800 meters, 6,700, 6,600. I checked the ascent rate, 45 meters per minute. Too fast for comfort, but not catastrophic. The chemical blow was designed for emergencies exactly like this, situations where controlled ascent wasn't an option. The engineers had built in margins for error. I had to trust that. My hands found the manual trim controls. I made small adjustments, trying to keep the Triton's nose level as we climbed. The sub wanted to pitch forward, the weight distribution thrown off by the jettisoned equipment and the water still sloshing in the compromised ballast tanks. I compensated, tweaking the remaining functional systems to maintain something approaching stable orientation. Minutes passed. I watched the depth gauge. 6,000 meters, 5,800, 5,600. The viewport crack hadn't spread. I checked it every 30 seconds, eyes tracing the hairline fracture that ran from the lower left corner upward about 15 centimeters. The pressure differential was decreasing as we climbed, less stress on the damaged viewport. I allowed myself a fraction of relief. My mouth was dry. I tried to swallow and found I couldn't produce enough saliva. When had I last had water? Before the dive. Hours ago. The cabin temperature was still elevated, humidity thick enough to feel like breathing through a wet cloth. But my body was dehydrated. Sweat had soaked my shirt during the descent, pulling moisture from my system faster than I'd realized. I looked toward the small emergency supply locker mounted on the starboard wall. Water bottles in there, along with basic first aid supplies. But leaving the pilot's seat meant abandoning the controls, and I didn't trust the Triton to maintain stable ascent without constant adjustment. I stayed in the seat. 5,000 meters, 4,800, 4,600. My vision started to blur at the edges. I blinked hard, forcing my eyes to focus on the instruments, the depth gauge, the trim indicators, the hull integrity monitors. I ran through them in sequence, over and over, a mental checklist that kept me anchored. The pain in my shoulder had settled into a deep, constant ache. I could move the arm, could grip the controls, but every motion sent sharp reminders of the impact against the bulkhead. My ribs hurt when I breathed too deeply. I kept my breathing shallow. 4,000 meters, 3,800, 3,600. The darkness outside the viewport remained absolute. We were still far below the depth where any sunlight penetrated. I'd read somewhere that sunlight disappeared completely below 1,000 meters. We had a long way to go before I'd see anything but black water and the occasional piece of debris caught in the floodlights. I thought about Benjamin and Grayson, about what they'd been, what they'd claimed to be. 300 million years, Benjamin had said. Their species, their civilization, predating mammals entirely. Reptilia. I'd seen the fossil records in museums, ancient creatures preserved in stone, but those were animals, primitive. What I'd witnessed in this cabin was intelligence, technology, language. They'd worn human faces like masks, infiltrated human society with perfect disguises. How many others were there? The question sat in my mind like a weight. Benjamin and Grayson were dead, crushed and consumed by something even older than they were. But they'd spoken about their species monitoring humanity, assessing whether contact or eradication was appropriate. That implied more of them. Somewhere. 3,000 meters, 2,800, 2,600. I pushed the thought away. I needed to focus on staying alive, on getting this damaged submersible to the surface. Everything else could wait. The Triton's ascent continued. I made constant small adjustments, fighting against the sub's tendency to nose down. The trim controls responded sluggishly, systems strained by damage and the compromised weight distribution. I compensated, overcorrected, compensated again. My hands were shaking. I looked down at them gripping the controls, saw the tremor running through my fingers. Adrenaline crash, probably. My body finally catching up to the last hour of terror. I tightened my grip, tried to steady myself. 2,000 meters, 1,800, 1,600. The stream of water from the fracture above the equipment bay had slowed to a trickle as external pressure decreased. Small mercy. The deck was flooded with several centimeters of seawater sloshing back and forth with the sub's movement. But at least it wasn't getting worse. I checked the time display on the console. The numbers didn't make sense at first. I stared at them, trying to reconcile what I was seeing. 6 hours. We'd been down there for 6 hours since the initial descent began. It felt like days. 1,000 meters. 900. 800. The darkness outside started to change. Subtly at first, so gradual I wasn't sure I was seeing it. The absolute black became something fractionally lighter. Deep blue-black instead of pure void. I leaned forward in the seat, ignoring the protest from my ribs, and stared through the viewport. The change continued, blue-black to dark blue. I could make out the water itself now, particles drifting past the floodlights. No longer just isolated debris, but the constant suspended matter of shallower depths. 700 meters, 600, 500. The blue deepened, lightened. I saw the surface somewhere far above, a ceiling of lighter water that marked the boundary between ocean and air. We were going to make it. The realization hit me with unexpected force. We were actually going to make it. 400 meters. 300. 200. I reached for the communications panel and activated the emergency beacon. It should have been transmitting already, automatic activation on ascent, but I wasn't taking chances. I flipped the switch manually and heard the steady ping of the distress signal broadcasting our position. 100 meters, 50, 25. The viewport showed light, real light, sunlight filtering down through the water. I could see the surface, waves visible from below as undulating patterns of brightness and shadow. The Triton broke through. The transition was sudden and jarring. Water to air, the viewport streaming with seawater that ran down the glass in sheets. I heard the waves slapping against the hull, heard something else, voices, shouting. I looked up through the viewport and saw the support ship. The research vessel that had deployed us, that had been waiting on the surface for our return. It loomed above, hull dark against the sky. Figures moved on the deck, crew members pointing, running toward the deployment crane. The Triton rocked in the waves. I sat in the pilot's seat, hands still gripping the controls even though we were stationary now. I heard metal clanging against the hull. The recovery hooks. They were attaching the lift cables. The sub lurched upward. I felt us rising out of the water, heard the ocean streaming off the hull in torrents. Through the viewport, I saw the deck of the support ship rising to meet us. Saw the crane operator in his booth making careful adjustments. Saw the deck crew waiting with their hands ready on the docking clamps. We touched down with a solid thunk. The Triton settled onto the deck cradle. I heard the clamps engage, heard the hiss of the external seal being attached to the hatch. Someone was shouting instructions. I couldn't make out the words through the hull. My hands finally released the controls. I tried to stand and my legs wouldn't support me. I collapsed back into the seat. The hatch wheel turned. I watched it rotate from inside, saw the locking mechanism disengage. The hatch swung open and daylight flooded in, so bright after hours in the red alarm lights that I had to close my eyes against it. Hands grabbed me. Multiple people, crew members pulling me up out of the seat, supporting my weight as my legs gave out completely. They hauled me through the hatch, through the external seal, out onto the deck. I felt solid deck plating beneath me as they lowered me down. Felt the sun on my face, warm and impossible. Heard voices asking questions I couldn't process. Someone pressed a water bottle into my hands. I collapsed onto the deck, flat on my back, staring up at the sky. Alive. I sat on the padded exam table in the medical bay, trying not to move too much. Every breath pulled at something tender in my ribs. The ship's doctor, a compact woman in her 50s named Dr. Chen, pressed 2 fingers against the side of my neck and counted silently while watching her watch. "Pulse is elevated but steady," she said, releasing my neck. "How's the shoulder?" "Hurts." "Specific location?" I rotated my right arm slowly, wincing when it reached about 45 degrees. "There. Feels like something pulled." She moved behind me and prodded the area with clinical precision. I sucked in air through my teeth. "Soft tissue damage," she said. "No dislocation. You're lucky." Lucky. I'd jettisoned $500,000 in equipment, Watched two people get crushed to death by something that shouldn't exist and barely made it back alive. But my shoulder wasn't dislocated. So yeah. Lucky. Dr. Chen came around to face me again, shining a pen light in each eye. Pupils responsive. Any headache? A little. Nausea? No. Dizziness when you stood earlier? Yeah, but it passed. She clicked off the pen light and made notes on a tablet. You're dehydrated and showing mild symptoms of decompression sickness. Nothing severe, but you need fluids and observation. I'm putting you on IV saline for the next 2 hours. I nodded. She moved to a cabinet and returned with an IV kit, antiseptic wipes, and a bag of clear fluid. I held out my left arm while she swabbed the inside of my elbow and inserted the needle with practiced efficiency. The cool sensation of saline entering my vein made me suddenly aware of how dry my mouth was. When did you last drink water? She asked, taping down the IV line. Before the dive. Maybe 8 hours ago. You should have been drinking during ascent. I was a little busy keeping the sub from imploding. She gave me a look that said she'd heard every excuse before. You're also bruised along your right side, ribs, hip, shoulder. What happened down there? I'd been preparing for this question since the moment the crane lifted me onto the deck. The story had to be simple, consistent, believable. Geological event, I said. The site collapsed. I had to emergency ascend, and the sub got knocked around during the shock wave. And the 2 passengers? They were in the escape pod when it happened. The collapse caught them. Dr. Chen studied my face for a long moment. I kept my expression neutral, meeting her eyes without looking away. Finally, she returned to her notes. I'll need to monitor you for the next 6 hours minimum, she said. Any worsening symptoms, you tell me immediately. Confusion, severe headache, vision problems, numbness. Understood. She adjusted the IV drip rate and stepped back. Rest. I'll check on you in 30 minutes. After she left, I leaned back against the wall behind the exam table and closed my eyes. The medical bay was quiet, except for the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor somewhere and the distant thrum of the ship's engines. My body ached in about a dozen places, but the saline was already helping. The fog in my head started to clear. I thought about Grayson's severed hand tumbling past the viewport. The scales, the claws, the way it had looked so alien even in death. I thought about Benjamin's vertical pupils and the cold certainty in his voice when he'd said I was a liability. I thought about the creature on the ocean floor, the eye, the mouth full of obsidian teeth. None of it should have been real. But it was. I opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling tiles. White acoustic panels with small perforations. Standard maritime medical bay. Everything normal. Everything rational. Except I knew better now. Dr. Chen came back twice over the next few hours to check my vitals and ask the same questions. Headache? No. Nausea? No. Dizziness? No. Each time I gave her the answer she wanted to hear. Each time she made notes and left me alone again. The saline bag emptied. She replaced it with a second one. You're responding well, she said. Color's better. Hydration levels improving. Can I get out of here soon? Another 2 hours. Then you can return to your quarters, but no strenuous activity. You need rest. I'll rest. She didn't look convinced, but didn't argue. After she left, I sat up straighter and tested my shoulder again. Still sore, but the sharp pain had dulled to a persistent ache. I could live with that. The ship's engines changed pitch slightly. We were moving at a steady speed now, heading back toward port. I didn't know exactly where we were, but the dive site had been roughly 200 nautical miles offshore. At the ship's cruising speed, that meant at least 18 hours before we reached land. 18 hours to keep my story straight. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew, Dr. Chen was removing the IV from my arm. "You're clear," she said. "But I want you back here if anything changes. Understood?" "Understood." She handed me a bottle of electrolyte solution. "Drink this, then get actual sleep in your bunk." I took the bottle and stood carefully. My legs held. The dizziness didn't return. I walked out of the medical bay and headed down the narrow corridor toward the crew quarters, passing other crew members who glanced at me with curiosity but didn't stop to ask questions. Word had already spread, I guessed. The pilot made it back. The corporate guys didn't. I reached my quarters and shut the door behind me. The room was small: a bunk, a narrow desk, a locker for personal items. I sat on the edge of the bunk and drank half the electrolyte solution in one go. It tasted like artificial fruit and salt, but my body needed it. The ship rolled gently beneath me. I set the bottle on the desk and lay back on the bunk, staring at the ceiling. My shoulder throbbed. My ribs ached. But I was alive. I stayed in my quarters for the rest of the day and through the night, only leaving once to use the head and grab food from the galley. The cook gave me a sympathetic look and loaded my plate with extra portions. I ate mechanically, tasting nothing, then returned to my bunk. Sleep came in fragments. I'd drift off, then jolt awake with images of vertical pupils or bioluminescent blue light burned into my vision. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I slept deeply for several hours. When I woke, pale morning light filtered through the small porthole above my desk. The ship's engines had changed pitch again, slower now, more deliberate. We were approaching port. I sat up, testing my body. Everything still hurt, but the sharp edges had dulled. I could move without wincing. That would have to be enough. I showered, dressed in clean clothes from my locker, and headed to the galley for coffee. The ship was quieter than usual. Most of the crew avoided eye contact when I passed them in the corridors. They didn't know what to say to someone who'd survived what I had, or what they thought I had. I was finishing my second cup of coffee when one of the deck crew found me. "Corporate's inbound," he said. "Helicopter, ETA 20 minutes. I nodded. "Thanks." He left without another word. 20 minutes. I poured the rest of my coffee down the sink and headed to the conference room on the main deck. It was a cramped space with a table bolted to the floor, 6 chairs, and a wall-mounted screen for presentations. I sat down on the side facing the door and waited. The helicopter arrived exactly on time. I heard it before I saw it, the distinctive thwop 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 of rotors cutting through ocean air. Through the conference room's single porthole, I watched it descend toward the landing pad on the aft deck. A Bell 429, corporate colors. Expensive. 3 people climbed out once the rotors stopped. 2 men in dark suits, 1 woman in business casual. They carried leather bags and tablets. The deck crew guided them inside. I stood when they entered the conference room. The woman led. She was in her 40s, blonde hair pulled back, sharp eyes that took in everything at once. The 2 men flanked her. One was older, gray at the temples, with the build of someone who'd spent time in the field before moving to management. The other was younger, maybe 30, with the eager expression of someone still trying to prove himself. "Mr. Bird," the woman said, extending her hand. "I'm Patricia Vance, Director of Operational Risk Assessment. This is Gerald Marks and Colin Trent." I shook hands with each of them. Patricia's grip was firm and brief. Gerald's was perfunctory. Colin's lingered a half-second too long, like he was trying to read something in the contact. "Please, sit," Patricia said. We all sat. She placed her tablet on the table in front of her. The two men did the same. "First, let me say we're relieved you made it back safely," Patricia said. "The loss of Mr. Weaver and Mr. Barnes is tragic, but we're grateful the situation wasn't worse." "Thank you," I said. "We need to understand exactly what happened down there," she continued. "For the record and for closure, can you walk us through the events?" I'd rehearsed this 100 times in my head during the ascent and the hours after. The key was to keep it simple. No unnecessary details. No contradictions. "We reached the target depth and located the geological formation," I said. It was a spire-like structure, approximately 40 meters in diameter at the base. Obsidian and metallic composition. We were conducting initial surveys when the seismic event occurred. "Seismic event?" Gerald asked. "The formation destabilized. Structural collapse. It happened fast, maybe 30 seconds from the first tremor to full collapse." Patricia made notes on her tablet. "And Mr. Weaver and Mr. Barnes?" They'd transferred to the escape pod to get a different visual angle on the structure. It was a standard procedure for dual observation. When the collapse started, they were already sealed inside. I tried to warn them, but the communications array was damaged in the initial shockwave. "The pod was destroyed in the collapse?" Colin asked. "Yes, crushed. I saw it happen through the viewport before I initiated emergency ascent." The three of them exchanged glances. Patricia tapped something on her tablet. "We'll need to review the data logs," she said. "I have them ready." I pulled out my own tablet, the one I'd spent 2 hours carefully editing during the ascent. I'd stripped out every frame showing Benjamin and Grayson's transformation, every audio file with their alien language, every anomalous reading from the creature on the seafloor. What remained was a clean narrative: geological survey, structural instability, catastrophic collapse, emergency ascent. I transferred the files to Patricia's tablet. She opened them immediately, scrolling through timestamps and sensor data. Gerald and Colin leaned in to review their own copies. The conference room fell silent, except for the quiet tapping of fingers on screens. I sat still, hands folded on the table, and watched their faces. Patricia's expression remained neutral. Gerald frowned occasionally but said nothing. Colin's eyes moved rapidly across his screen, scanning for inconsistencies. Minutes passed. The ship's engines rumbled beneath us. Somewhere outside, crew members shouted instructions to each other. "The seismic readings are consistent with structural failure," Gerald said finally. "Pressure differentials, material stress, collapse progression. It all tracks." Patricia nodded. "The timeline matches your account. Communications failure at 0942, escape pod separation at 0943, collapse event at 0944. "And the Triton sustained significant damage," Colin added, looking up from his tablet. "Jettisoned equipment, hull fracture, viewport crack. You're lucky you made it back." "I know," I said. Patricia set down her tablet and looked directly at me. "Mr. Bird, I need to ask this for the record. Is there anything about the events that you haven't disclosed? Anything that might affect our understanding of what happened?" I met her eyes without hesitation. "No, I've told you everything." She held my gaze for a long moment. I didn't blink, didn't look away, didn't let anything show on my face except tired honesty. "All right," she said. "We'll include your account in the official report. The company accepts your version of events and thanks you for your service under extremely difficult circumstances." Gerald closed his tablet. "You handled the emergency well. The jettison decision probably saved your life." "It was the only option," I said. Colin was still frowning at his screen, scrolling back through something. The energy signature readings just before the collapse. These spikes here. Do you know what caused them? I'd anticipated this question. The spikes were remnants I couldn't fully scrub without making the edit obvious. I'd left them in and built a cover story around them. Electromagnetic discharge from the structure's metallic components during the collapse, I said. The materials were under extreme stress. It's not uncommon in formations with high mineral content. Colin looked at Patricia. She nodded slightly. That's consistent with the metallurgical analysis, she said. Colin closed his tablet, apparently satisfied. Patricia stood. The two men followed her lead. I stood as well. We'll be filing the incident report within 48 hours, Patricia said. You'll receive a copy for your records. The company will also be conducting a full review of deep-sea operational protocols. Your input may be requested during that process. Understood, I said. In the meantime, you're on paid leave pending medical clearance. Dr. Chen's report indicates you need at least 2 weeks of recovery time. I'll follow her recommendations. Patricia extended her hand again. Thank you, Mr. Bird. We appreciate your cooperation. I shook hands with all three of them again. They gathered their tablets and bags and filed out of the conference room. Through the porthole, I watched them cross the deck toward the helicopter. The rotors started up. Within minutes, they were airborne, banking away toward the mainland. I stayed in the conference room for a while after they left, staring at the empty table. The lies had worked. They'd believed every word. The edited data logs had passed inspection. As far as the company was concerned, Benjamin Weaver and Grayson Barnes had died in a tragic but explainable accident. No one would ever know the truth. I picked up my tablet and walked out of the conference room. The ship was moving steadily toward port now. I could see the coastline in the distance, a thin dark line against the horizon. I made my way to the outer deck and stood at the railing. The wind hit me immediately, cold and sharp, carrying the salt smell of open ocean. Afternoon was fading into evening. The sky had started to shift toward deeper blue. I gripped the railing and looked out at the water. Somewhere far beneath the surface, in the deepest part of the trench, the spire still stood. The creature still lived, and maybe others like Benjamin and Grayson were still out there, hidden among humans, watching and waiting. I'd survived. I'd lied. I'd buried the truth so deep no one would ever find it. But I knew what I'd seen was real. I stood near the starboard railing, away from the busiest sections of deck where crew members moved with purpose between stations. The breeze carried salt spray and diesel fumes. My shoulder still ached from the impact against the bulkhead, a dull throb that sharpened whenever I moved my arm too quickly. I'd borrowed a tablet from one of the crew members earlier. Marcus, I think his name was. A younger guy who worked maintenance on the support equipment. He'd handed it over without much question when I'd asked, probably assuming I needed it for some kind of post-incident documentation. The tablet had thermal imaging capability, standard equipment for checking mechanical systems and spotting heat leaks in the ship's infrastructure. I pulled up the thermal camera application and watched the screen flicker to life. The interface was straightforward, a live feed that translated heat signatures into color gradients. Reds and oranges indicated higher temperatures. Blues and purples showed cooler surfaces. I adjusted the sensitivity settings until the display showed clear differentiation between objects. My hands weren't entirely steady. The IV fluids Dr. Chen had administered helped with the dehydration, but my body still carried the physical memory of what happened in the Triton. Every time I gripped something, I felt the phantom sensation of those controls under my palms while the sub plummeted toward crush depth. I pointed the tablet's camera at a cluster of crew members working near the crane assembly about 30 feet away. 3 of them appeared on screen immediately, their forms outlined in bright orange and red. The colors pulsed slightly with each movement, shifting as blood flow and muscle activity changed their surface temperatures. Normal human body temperature hovered around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. The thermal signatures I saw matched that range. One of the crew members turned and walked toward the port side. I tracked him with the camera, watching his heat signature remain consistent as he moved. Another crew member bent down to secure a cable, and the exertion caused a slight increase in his thermal output. His torso glowed brighter orange for a few seconds before returning to the baseline. I needed to know. Benjamin and Grayson had appeared completely human until they revealed themselves. Their disguises were flawless. Synthetic skin that moved naturally, facial expressions that mimicked human emotion, voices that carried no hint of their true nature. But they hadn't sweated in the cabin when the temperature climbed. They hadn't blinked during pressure changes. And their bodies had maintained an unnatural stillness that only became obvious in retrospect. If they could hide among humans that effectively, others could too. And if there were others, I needed a way to identify them before I found myself trapped again. I moved along the deck, scanning different crew members as I went. A deckhand coiling rope near the stern showed a normal signature, bright orange across his torso and arms, slightly cooler at his extremities where circulation decreased. A technician checking equipment near the main winch registered the same pattern. I passed two crew members having a conversation near the equipment lockers and scanned them both. Normal. Both of them. The galley entrance was open, and I could see inside to where the cook was preparing the next meal. I angled the tablet to capture him on screen. His thermal signature bloomed red and orange, particularly around his face and hands, where he worked near the hot stove. Two deckhands sat at a table inside, eating an early dinner. I scanned them both. Normal heat patterns, slightly elevated around their core where digestion increased metabolic activity. I walked toward the bridge, climbing the external stairs with the tablet held loosely in my left hand. My right shoulder protested the movement, but I ignored it. The bridge door was propped open for ventilation, and I could see the captain standing near the helm, reviewing a navigation chart with the first mate. I stood in the doorway and raised the tablet, scanning them both from a distance. Captain Reynolds appeared on screen first, a solid orange and red figure with normal temperature distribution. The first mate, a woman named Sarah Oakes, showed the same pattern. I shifted the camera to scan the navigator seated at the console. Normal signature. His hands glowed slightly brighter where they rested on the warm electronics. I backed out of the doorway before anyone noticed me standing there. The tablet's screen showed nothing unusual. Everyone I'd scanned so far registered as human. I descended the stairs and headed toward the crew quarters below deck. The corridors were narrow, lit by fluorescent strips that hummed faintly. I could hear voices and movement from behind closed doors, crew members resting between shifts, playing cards, listening to music. I walked slowly, scanning through open doorways when I passed them. A maintenance worker emerged from one of the rooms, and I lifted the tablet as casually as I could manage. His thermal signature appeared normal, bright orange torso, red around the neck and face. He nodded at me as he passed, and I nodded back, lowering the tablet. Two more crew members came down the corridor from the opposite direction. I scanned them both. Normal signatures. One of them had a slightly elevated temperature around his left knee, probably an old injury causing inflammation. But otherwise, both registered as human. I reached the engine room entrance and stood in the doorway, looking down into the cramped, noisy space below. 3 crew members worked among the machinery, one checking pressure gauges, another adjusting a valve assembly, the third recording readings on a clipboard. I scanned each of them through the thermal camera. All 3 showed normal human heat patterns. their signatures slightly brighter due to the elevated ambient temperature in the engine room. I'd scanned over 20 crew members. Every single one had appeared normal. I climbed back up to the main deck and emerged into the late afternoon light. The sun sat lower on the horizon now, casting long shadows across the deck. I could see the corporate helicopter in the distance, approaching from the direction of the coast. It would land soon to retrieve the 3 representatives who'd conducted my debriefing earlier. I walked toward the helipad area where the corporate team stood waiting. Patricia Vance, Gerald Marks, and Colin Trent. They'd arrived hours ago, questioned me extensively, reviewed the edited data logs, and accepted my fabricated account of the incident. Now they were preparing to leave, their briefcases in hand, their expressions professionally neutral. I raised the tablet and pointed it toward them, trying to appear casual, as if I were simply checking something on the device. The thermal camera captured all 3 figures on screen. Patricia Vance appeared first, a bright orange and red signature consistent with normal human body temperature. She stood with her arms crossed, watching the approaching helicopter. Her heat pattern showed no irregularities. I shifted the tablet slightly to scan Gerald Marks. He stood to Vance's left, holding his briefcase in one hand and checking his phone with the other. His thermal signature bloomed red and orange across the screen, normal temperature distribution, slightly elevated around his face where he'd been talking extensively during the debriefing. I moved the tablet to scan Colin Trent. The screen showed his figure outlined in cooler colors, blues and pale greens instead of oranges and reds. The pattern was irregular, patches of warmth around his torso and head, but overall significantly cooler than the other 2 representatives standing beside him. His surface temperature registered at least 15 degrees lower than it should have. I stared at the screen, feeling my pulse hammer in my temples. The helicopter drew closer, its rotors creating a growing thunder that vibrated through the deck. I kept the tablet raised, watching Trent's thermal signature remain stubbornly cool compared to everyone else I'd scanned. There was no mistaking it. No equipment malfunction that would explain the discrepancy. I'd just scanned Vance and Marks seconds ago, and both had appeared completely normal. Colin Trent turned his head and looked directly at me. I froze, the tablet still raised, the thermal camera feed still visible on screen. Trent's eyes locked onto mine across the 30 feet of deck that separated us. His expression didn't change, the same professionally polite mask he'd worn during the entire debriefing. But his gaze held mine with an intensity that made my injured shoulder ache worse. I lowered the tablet slowly, forcing myself to maintain eye contact. My throat felt dry despite all the fluids Dr. Chen had pumped into me. Trent stood completely still, watching me with those steady, unblinking eyes. The wind from the approaching helicopter whipped his suit jacket, but he didn't react to it, didn't blink against the debris stirred up by the rotors. The helicopter touched down on the helipad with a heavy thump. Vance and Marks immediately moved toward it, ducking slightly against the rotor wash. Trent held my gaze for another long moment, his expression unreadable, his posture unnaturally still. Then he turned and followed the other 2 representatives toward the helicopter. I watched him walk away, his movements fluid and precise, nothing obviously wrong with his gait or posture. He climbed into the helicopter after Vance and Marks, settling into a seat near the open door. The crew chief secured the door and gave the pilot a signal. The helicopter lifted off smoothly, rising above the deck and banking toward the horizon. I stood near the railing, the tablet hanging loosely in my left hand, watching the aircraft grow smaller against the darkening sky. Trent had known exactly what I was doing, and he'd let me see. I shouldered my gear bag and walked down the gangway the next morning, boots hitting the metal grating with a hollow rhythm that echoed across the dock. The support ship sat behind me, massive and silent except for the sounds of crew unloading equipment and running post-voyage checks. I'd slept maybe 3 hours total, waking up every time the ship's engines changed pitch or someone walked past my door. My ribs still ached with every deep breath, and my shoulder felt stiff despite the anti-inflammatories Dr. Chen had given me before I left the medical bay. The dock smelled like salt water and diesel fuel, familiar in a way that usually felt comfortable. Today it just reminded me of how far down I'd been, how much pressure had surrounded the Triton on all sides while Benjamin and Grayson stood there with their scales and their vertical pupils, explaining how humans were fragile and limited. I adjusted the bag's strap on my good shoulder and kept walking, passing 2 dock workers who were securing lines to bollards. They didn't look up. I stopped about halfway down the dock and turned back. The ship looked exactly like it always did. White hulls streaked with rust in a few places, the crane assembly towering over the stern, the bridge windows reflecting morning light. Nothing about it suggested what had happened 3 days ago at the bottom of the Challenger Deep. The Triton sat in its cradle on the aft deck, covered now with a protective tarp. I could see the edges of the damaged viewport underneath. The hairline crack still visible if you knew where to look. The company would repair it or scrap it, depending on what their risk assessment people decided. Either way, I wouldn't be piloting it again. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, just looking. Then I turned and headed toward the parking area, weaving between shipping containers and stacks of equipment crates. My truck was where I'd left it 2 weeks ago, covered in a thin layer of dust. I threw my gear bag in the bed and climbed into the cab, started the engine, and pulled out onto the access road that led away from the port. The drive to my apartment took 40 minutes. I lived in a neighborhood about 6 miles inland. Nothing fancy, but quiet, with older buildings that had been converted into rental units sometime in the 90s. I parked in my assigned spot and grabbed the bag, climbed 2 flights of stairs, and unlocked the door to my place. The air inside was stale and warm. I'd forgotten to adjust the thermostat before I left. I dropped the bag by the door and walked through the small living room to the kitchen, opened the fridge, and found a half-empty carton of orange juice that was probably still good. I drank straight from the carton, then set it back and closed the door. My desk sat in the corner of the living room near the window, an old wooden thing I'd bought at a thrift store years ago. I pulled out the chair and sat down, wincing as my ribs protested, then opened my laptop and waited for it to boot up. The screen glowed blue, then loaded my desktop. I opened a browser and pulled up the first database I needed, an industry archive that tracked deep-sea expeditions going back about 20 years. It wasn't comprehensive, but it had enough data to start with. I typed in search terms: unexplained equipment failure, rapid decompression, personnel lost, structural collapse. The database returned 63 results. I started going through them one by one, reading the incident summaries and checking the details. Most of them were exactly what they claimed to be: mechanical failures, human error, bad weather, but a few had elements that didn't quite fit. A submersible lost near the Mariana Trench, with no clear cause. A research vessel that reported a seismic event, but whose data logs showed no corresponding activity. A crew member who vanished from a locked compartment during a deepwater survey. I opened a text file and started making notes. Dates, locations, companies involved, names of personnel. I copied and pasted sections of the reports that stood out, flagged anything that mentioned electromagnetic anomalies or unexplained energy readings. After about an hour, I had a list of 12 incidents that seemed worth investigating further. Next, I pulled up corporate personnel records. These were harder to access. Most companies didn't make their employee rosters public, but I had login credentials for a few industry networks from previous contracts. I searched for the names I'd pulled from the incident reports, cross-referencing them with current employment databases. Some of the people were still working in the industry. Others had moved on to different fields or retired. A few were listed as deceased. I opened another tab and started searching news articles. I typed in variations of deep sea accident, ocean research incident, unexplained disappearance, and filtered by date ranges that matched the incidents I'd flagged. The results were scattered, local news outlets mostly, with a few entries from industry publications. I read through them carefully, noting which companies had been involved and which individuals had been present. One article mentioned a researcher named Dr. Elaine Cortez, who had survived a submersible failure near the Puerto Rico Trench. Another described a salvage operation led by a contractor named Marcus Hale, who reported strange sonar readings before his equipment malfunctioned. I added both names to my list. My phone buzzed on the desk. I glanced at the screen and saw an incoming call from a number I recognized, an expedition company based out of San Diego that I'd worked with a few times over the years. They were probably calling about a contract, maybe a survey job or a retrieval operation. I let it ring until it went to voicemail, then set the phone face down and went back to the laptop. I pulled up a map and started marking locations. The Mariana Trench, the Puerto Rico Trench, the Tonga Trench, the Peru-Chile Trench. Most of the incidents I'd flagged had occurred in deep water zones, places where the ocean floor dropped beyond 6,000 meters. A few were in shallower areas, but even those were remote, far from shipping lanes, far from regular patrols. I zoomed in on the Mariana Trench and stared at the cluster of markers I'd placed there. 3 incidents within a 10-year span, all involving equipment failures, and all resulting in at least 1 fatality. I leaned back in the chair and rubbed my eyes. My shoulder throbbed, and I realized I'd been sitting hunched over the laptop for close to 2 hours without moving. I stood and walked to the window, looked out at the city below. The streets were busy with midday traffic, people going about their routines without any idea what was hidden beneath the surface of the ocean, without any idea that Benjamin and Grayson had been walking among them, wearing synthetic skin and speaking perfect English, pretending to be human while they retrieved relics from a civilization that predated mammals. Colin Trent's face came back to me, the way he'd looked at me on the deck, calm and unblinking, while the thermal scan showed his body temperature 15 degrees too low. He'd known what I was doing. He'd let me see. Maybe because he wanted me to know, or maybe because he didn't care. Either way, he was still out there. And if he was, there were others. I turned away from the window and went back to the desk. I sat down and opened another database, this one focused on corporate mergers and acquisitions in the marine research industry. I wanted to know which companies had consolidated over the past decade, which executives had moved between firms, which operations had been quietly shut down or transferred. The search returned hundreds of results. I started filtering by keywords: deep sea, trench, high pressure, submersible, and the list narrowed to 47 entries. I clicked on the first one and started reading. The company was called Oceanic Dynamics, a mid-sized firm that had been acquired by a larger conglomerate 3 years ago. The acquisition had been described as routine, a consolidation of resources to improve operational efficiency. But the timeline stood out. Oceanic Dynamics had reported 2 major equipment failures in the 6 months leading up to the acquisition, both involving deep-water submersibles. After the acquisition, no further incidents were reported. I made a note of the company name and the executives involved, then moved on to the next entry. By the time I finished going through the list, I had identified 6 companies with similar patterns: equipment failures or personnel losses followed by acquisitions, restructuring, or sudden shifts in operational focus. I cross-referenced the names of the executives with the personnel records I'd pulled earlier and found 3 matches. Individuals who had been present during incidents and who now held senior positions at major research firms. I opened a new document and started organizing the information. I created columns for names, dates, locations, companies, and incident types. I filled in what I had so far, leaving gaps where I needed more data. The list was incomplete, full of holes and assumptions, but it was a start. I saved the file and backed it up to an encrypted drive, then closed the laptop and sat back. My phone buzzed again. I picked it up and checked the screen. Another missed call, this time from a number I didn't recognize. No voicemail. I set it down and stood, walked to the kitchen, and poured myself a glass of water. I drank it slowly, leaning against the counter, thinking about what came next. I could walk away. I could take the medical leave, let the company finish their review, and go back to work once I was cleared. I could pretend the spire and the creature and Benjamin and Grayson had never happened, that Colin Trent's cold thermal signature was just the equipment glitch. I could file the whole thing away and move on with my life. But I wouldn't. Because I'd seen it. I'd been there, at the bottom of the trench, with the spire rising out of the silt and the creature opening its eye beneath the Triton. I'd watched Benjamin peel away his synthetic skin and heard him explain that his species had been monitoring humanity for longer than we'd existed. I'd survived, and now I knew what was hidden in plain sight. I set the glass in the sink and went back to the desk. I opened the laptop again and pulled up the personnel records, started checking names and locations one by one. I didn't know how many of them were out there, or where they were, or what they were planning, but I was going to find out. I was going to keep looking until I found them all.